Welcome to the Deep Chat.
And probably like, I don't want to say what is the point of BJJ, of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, but like, I guess, yeah, what is the point? Why are people doing it? Is it for self-defense? Is it for being aggressive? Why does one get involved in it?
Well, Jiu Jitsu originally started off as what they called the gentle art, right? And the point was not really to harm someone, to defeat them without harming them. In that respect, it's a sport, not even a sport, but a combat sport, I guess you could say, because it's not purely a sport. It can be used for self-defense. It is a combat sport where you can effectively go full throttle and you can practice it without harming each other. So with stand-up fighting, where you're kicking and punching, you can never really test it 100% unless you're going into MMA competitions. And you can't test it 100% because if you did that 3 days a week in training, you would never survive. You'd get hit in the head too often. You would have broken knuckles. You would have contusions all over your body. You would probably get concussed too many times. There's a million reasons why you can't go hard with stand-up fighting. There's very few reasons why you can't go at maximal effort in BJJ and train that way on a consistent basis. Now, you shouldn't go 100% all the time with BJJ because it does wear on your body, but you can do it a lot more frequently than you can with stand-up fighting. So it makes it enjoyable for a lot of people because it's a physical workout. It is teaching you something that people feel gives them confidence. And another aspect of it really is the mechanical and sort of technical approach. You can analyze it and get better through analysis, leverage points, how you move your body, your hips in relation to theirs. And there's a lot of deep thought that goes into the mechanics of BJJ. So a lot of very smart people gravitate towards it. But then you add all those things together. It's a workout, and there's a confidence boost, and there's an intellectual effort in it. And so between those three, it makes it a lot of fun.
So that like knowledge you're describing, is that encoded in like an algebraic way? Can I read a book and understand the moves and the mechanics of it, or like?
Well, to some degree, it depends on the school. There's some schools that do a very fixed set of drills. So by the end of 6 months, you need to know these particular drills, and you need to have drilled them to the point where you can do them well. And in a sense, it's algebraic, right? There's a formula. If you were to talk to some of the, long-term gods of jiu-jitsu, and one of those would be Rickson Gracie, who I was fortunate enough to train under for some time. He would put an emphasis on being in uncomfortable situations and not using your strength to get out of them, right? To use your leverage and use your brains to understand and get comfortable with discomfort. Because if you're uncomfortable or you panic in these situations, bad things happen. You lose the fight or somebody gets hurt. So his first thing is always establishing a good base, understanding how to move your body and not fall or not lose position. So position is everything in jiu-jitsu. And that comes through not using all of your muscle, right? The key is not to, if you rely on your physical strength, you can only go so far. But if you rely on your intellect and understanding leverage, understanding the fundamentals, which Rickson is all about, he's known as the hidden jiu-jitsu guy, because he will show you things that you most people aren't. You don't even see it happening.
The secrets the jiu-jitsu masters didn't want you to know. That's a great headline.
That's what it sounds like, but it's in effect, it's true. This is what he does so well. I've seen so many black belts come into his school who are black belts, and he'll show them. He'll say, "Okay, do it your way," and it will fail. And then he'll say, "Now I'm going to show you a few things. Do it my way," and then it will work. And it's not. I mean, I've applied the things he says, and they work. He's just a brilliant teacher. It really just comes down to being a teacher who truly understands the mechanics. That's the difference. It's not a secret. It's just some people don't understand the mechanics.
So you have a history with this, whereas I don't. Maybe we should start there. For listeners who don't know, what is your relationship to martial arts and jiu-jitsu in particular?
I've been doing martial arts all my life in some form, at least 35 years. Which doesn't mean much, by the way. You could say I've done martial arts 35 years and gone once every 2 months.
Sure. Yeah,
but for about 15 years of that, there was, I was on the mats training 3 to 5 days a week, 10 hours each week, maybe. So extensive. And it goes from stand-up fighting, type martial arts to BJJ, judo, kali, all weapons, non-weapons, handguns. I've worked with a lot of cops. In fact, more cops than civilians, trained with them all. I've even taught police, the younger police who still needed training because police don't get training much, which we can talk about. My mentor is a retired U.S. Marshal, retired cop. And the group of people that I work with are also, as I said, mostly police, ranging from federal down to local. And then also military people who are not police, but just come in to train.
So we could maybe draw some parallels to something like sumo wrestling, which I also know very little about. But I know there's like schools of thought, and there's a philosophy and a mechanics and a scoring, and there's matches, and it's physical combat. But I'm also aware no one says like, oh, we're a security firm and everyone's trained in sumo wrestling and we're going to apply that during security. On the other hand, I am hearing now a lot about proposals of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu being used, or techniques like that being used in law enforcement and stuff like that. What's the difference there?
Well, I can't speak to sumo, obviously, because that has a rigid set of rules, whereas jiu-jitsu doesn't have a rigid set of rules. It works better under certain situations, like one-on-one fighting versus, 3-on-1. If you're the one and you're doing jiu-jitsu and there's 3 people, you're going to get your face stomped in.
Sure.
The main difference there is the rule set that was wrapped around it, where sumo, there's a bunch of rules. And the goal is to, if I'm not mistaken, to get someone out of the ring.
Yeah, I think so.
Similar to wrestling, there are rules in wrestling, but the athleticism, let's just say that if you took an average trained sumo person and stood them up against the average human, they would destroy that human in a fight.
Sure.
They would throw them around like a rag doll.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that sumo has a lot of rules, it's not ideal for combat, it still creates physical characteristics and physical capability that would help you dominate a normal person.
Almost in the sense of that you're an athlete, so of course you have an advantage because most are not. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So extend that to something like in sumo, you are put into a position that if you're unfamiliar with it. Now, let's take 2 athletes, okay? You've got a sumo athlete and a professional wrestler, or not wrestler, a football player.
Sure.
Maybe equal weight. And you were to put them to go at it in the sumo rules, and the goal was to throw someone else out of the ring. Who do you think would win?
Well, if I assume that there is an art to sumo, I would say the sumo wrestler, but it could also come down to the biggest guy always wins. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know the nature of the challenge.
As I said, they're both the same weight.
Yeah, in that case, I would have to presume that there's at least some amount of skill involved in sumo, and the sumo guy would have the advantage.
And it's because they've been put into these positions before, and they know what to do. So in BJJ, let's talk about what we haven't said yet. So do you want to talk about why we're talking about this?
Yeah, what's got me really hot about it, we've alluded to it, is that, well, first, and I had kind of heard about this part, that there was a thought that these should be techniques we train police on and get them using, and that this would have like a suite of obvious benefits, that it would be better for the police officers, for people being investigated, for actual criminals, for suspected criminals, really down to that core thing you mentioned, that it's a technique for subduing, was maybe the word you used, without harming.
Right.
Which, of course, I mean, I guess there are extreme people who don't want the police around anymore, but I think most reasonable people would say the police, even if they need to be reformed, should have authority and should be able to subdue people. So how can we do that without murdering them? And
Right.
If this is the way to do it, that would be great. So yeah, sounds good on paper. But in addition to just sounding good on paper, there's now some statistics from one particular department that adopted it. And these are very compelling statistics to me, if true. So just broadly speaking, I'll hit some of their high points. They found that, so they trained certain officers, new officers, to do this program, do some regular training in this. And then they looked at the effects about a year later, found that those who were trained deployed tasers less often, 23% reduction in taser deployments, 48% reduction in officer injuries, 59% less likely to engage in unauthorized acts of, I forget what that acronym stands for, use of force.
Use of force, yep.
And then, to top it all off, a very compelling argument that if you just assume that the injuries that they reduced and the cost of rehabilitation and workman's comp and all that, that those fees were greater than the fees of the training program. Meaning, like, why wouldn't everyone immediately adopt this program?
Okay, so the important thing to stay coming out of this is everyone should know that police officers, before they hit the street, receive very little training in hand-to-hand combat or use of force.
I was shocked to learn this, yeah.
Next
it was like
to none.
basically none.
Yes. By the time I was 12, I probably had more experience in hand-to-hand combat than most of these people have. I'm serious. It's that minimal. It
Now,
doesn't.
devil's advocate, though, most freshmen in college starting a computer science degree already know how to program, even if it's not technically required. Do most people who want to go into public service in the police department have a background that's adequate in these areas?
I think it's more likely that they're brawlers who are physical people than it is to say that they have actual training. In my experience, there's a broad range. There's people who see it as a good job and go into it because it's a good job, but they're very kind-hearted and non-confrontational people. So I think the range is all over the place. There are certainly some people who it's their calling. They've been training all their life. They're going to be a cop.
Sure.
But just as many of the opposite, where they just fell into it and they decided, well, I need a job and I've got a good record and it seems like a good thing to do. That being said, there's minimal training coming out of the academy.
In physical altercation handling, right?
Yes, and even guns. It's not like they get a ton of training. I don't know what the number is, but they're not shooting every day for months and months and months on end. It doesn't require that much training to be able to shoot a gun, to be honest.
Yeah,
But
that's fair.
it requires more training. See, here's the thing that applies to both of these. Getting in a confrontation and getting in a shooting. Both of these, you have to talk about the physiological effect on the body first. Because both of those have an effect where there's an adrenaline dump. I forgot the actual term for it, but basically your body releases a bunch of adrenaline. When that happens, your body starts to behave a little bit different, right? Your reaction time increases, but at the same time, you're jittery and your nerves. And I'll give you the perfect example. It was used in a study, and I don't have it, but there was a LAPD officer who had the distinguished expert rating for shooting a gun. That means you could hit, I believe you hit 300 out of 300 shots on target, right? From various ranges, up, down, kneeling, standing, leaning against a wall, all that stuff. So he's a very good shot. And he got in an altercation where he had to fire his gun, and the first shot went off at his toe. The second one about 2 feet out from him. The third one at the other person's feet, and that person was less than 10 feet away. Most gunshots occur less than 10 feet away. And then finally he hit the guy. So he had fired 3 shots before hitting the guy. And this is a guy who could draw with the best of them. But once that adrenaline kicks in, everything changes. your body doesn't respond the same way. It has to be something that you train for, that adrenaline dump, that discomfort.
Could I use that as some part of a not guilty plea? Hey, I wasn't in control of my mind?
No, I don't think so, but I'm not a legal expert. But there is a physiological thing that happens. So really, the first thing that I always would recommend when talking to people who are interested in self-defense is you don't even have to learn to punch. You don't have to learn much. You just have to learn how to keep yourself and your composure in a stressful situation so you don't make bad decisions. And if you can learn to do that, you might even be able to shut down most situations early because you're in control. But if you lose it, like take, for example, a cop who can't stand it when people say he's a pig.
Yeah.
I mean, there are cops that,
We'll lose it.
they get poked by people easily.
Yeah.
Oh,
Which
you're
is not an ideal thing we want in a police officer.
Exactly. Like I have stories about that too from some of my
Sure.
cop friends who just said, I just stay away from them because they're bad news. And most of them wash out early if they're going to be that sensitive.
That's good.
Because if you're a cop, you have to be able to be yelled at. You have to be able to be called names.
Yeah, that's part of your job, yes.
It's part of your job.
It's going to be weird and unfair.
So in that same respect, you need to be able to control yourself when being yelled at, but you also need to be able to control yourself when it gets physical. And that's the first step. But how do you do that? How do you teach people that? How do you teach people to be comfortable in discomfort? One of the ways is through this type of training, like BJJ or stand-up training, where, one of the things my instructor used to do, he would bring down other cops, and during a test, they would be yelling at us, saying how bad we're doing and swearing at us and all sorts of heinous stuff. And but at the end of it, they can tell whether or not you are composed, and it works. It's possible. They do this in the military too. They put them around gunfire and things like that.
So let me see if I've got this straight. Like, I don't know if he's a dojo master, whatever, the main teacher guy. He's going to maybe put me in some chokehold. I'm super uncomfortable. Probably my instinct is to squirm and say, Uncle, let me out of this. But by being in this choked position, I'm not dying, but I'm uncomfortable. It's sort of not only a test of my character, I guess, but also training exercise in that you rarely will feel this way. So let's put you in an uncomfortable position so you're sure that you've trained your mind how to behave in that scenario. Is that the gist of it?
Well, that's the first step for me. And I'll give you an example. In BJJ, there was a guy he was a black belt, and he was on top of me, and his shirt was sweaty, and it was no gi, so you're not wearing a gi, so it was just clothes, and it was totally sweaty, and it was like I was getting waterboarded because it was going in my mouth. It was all on my face, and anytime if I tried to breathe through my mouth, it would go in my mouth. And it was uncomfortable. Now I'm totally familiar with these uncomfortable feelings. So for me, it was uncomfortable. It wasn't, panic uncomfortable, but for others, it might be.
Yeah.
And in a BJJ school, you're doing that in a safe environment. You're getting familiar with that discomfort in an environment where you can take those risks on the mats. So you're training your body to deal with the discomfort. And it's not as uncomfortable as if it was really happening where it was life or death, but it is at least a better approximation than doing nothing. That's the first step.
Well, why do we need the jiu-jitsu, though? Why don't we just have discomfort training independent of the other stuff?
Okay, good question. So I am putting the emphasis on the mental aspects of it first, but now we're talking about the physical aspect of it and why BJJ is good in this case. BJJ in particular is good because, one-on-one situation, or, often there's two police, but let's say it's a one-on-one situation. Your goal as a cop is to do less damage, control the suspect, and potentially, search him and put cuffs on them with the least bodily injury to both of you as possible.
Yep.
Assuming there's no other weapons involved, because that goes down a whole nother rabbit hole of escalation and the rules around it.
Yeah, it's more complicated.
Yeah. So assuming there's none of that, all you're trying to do is make sure that You can hold someone down either until help arrives, or you are able to hold them down, calm them down, get them cuffed or in a position where they can't harm you or themselves.
Yep.
That's quite often the case.
All right, so there's a cop shows up at the scene of a complaint. There's an aggressive person who maybe a cop is supposed to play innocent until proven guilty, but this person obviously just committed a crime. They look intoxicated. They look like they could hurt somebody. They don't appear to have a weapon. That's a good scenario to apply jiu-jitsu then, yes?
Well, potentially. I mean, you try with words, right? But if you have to, if they're unwilling, if they're unwilling to come, if they don't turn around and let you put them in cuffs, or they don't sit down on the curb where you tell them to, it all comes down to when they're not following instructions, right? So let's say he's non-compliant, and non-compliant means you have to force them. Remember what I said about if you had two equally strong people and they were to compete in a sumo match, and one was sumo trained and one wasn't.
Yep.
The sumo trained person would win. So the same thing applies here. Most people are not trained in how to, in BJJ or wrestling. Most people are not. Yep. They're not trained in how to hold someone down. They're not trained in how to throw someone to the ground. They're not trained in how to get up when the full weight of a human being is on your back. They're not trained for that. In this situation where, according to these statistics, I buy it because anybody who has done BJJ for some time will come away knowing more than the average person about how to utilize your body to hold someone down or to dominate them and put them in a position of inability to do something. You will just gain familiarity with the uncomfortable in this sense. You will know, how do I apply my weight here or there to succeed in stopping someone? And in that familiarity with the uncomfortable, and then paired with the physical skills to do it, you're less likely to use of force because you don't panic as much. Because you know that when you need it, you can resort to it. You know, like they always say, people who trained in martial arts the longest are the ones least likely to fight.
Aha.
I don't know if that statistic is true, but it certainly seems true to me.
Well, there's an analog to the results I read earlier, which I went through them kind of quick, we should review. They break down into, well, really 5 areas, but 4 that are important to me. The first one that's just an interesting anecdote, they reported on training injuries. There were 95 officers trained in over 2,600 classes, and 1 reported training injury. Now, they didn't say what it is, but I'm guessing like a twisted ankle, not like a catastrophic brain hemorrhage from falling on the mat. If anything, that sounds low to me. 2,600 hours of training and you had 1 injury, there should have been a couple of twisted ankles more than that, right?
Maybe. It depends on the school. Some schools place more of an emphasis on more, gentle training and getting familiar with the positions without forcing it. When you try to force something where you go 100% and use all your strength, that's when the injuries happen. When you move really fast, that's when the injuries happen. The school I always trained at, the people, they were not into really explosive jiu-jitsu. They were into more traditional, sort of methodical jiu-jitsu, where you take your time, you don't lose your cool, and you slowly put yourself into the best position. The schools that are more sport-oriented, where you're moving really fast and there's a clock and it's about time and speed. You might be moving your knee real fast to flip over to the other side or get a knee over their belly. And when you move that knee, you might hit them in the head. Mm-hmm. And then that happens. There's a lot of black eyes in jiu-jitsu. Well, not a lot, but it happens. I would say that is probably low. That's my guess, that they just underreported. What did they call an injury? It would be my question. Is a black eye an injury? Is a sore muscle an injury? Is having to tape up your finger an injury? Or are we talking injury that took them out of the game? Did it take them out of jiu-jitsu class? Right.
The answer seems to be no. So overall, the training seems safe.
Yeah, it's generally safe. Yes, yeah. It's not, again, if you were to go full throttle, or even if you were to go 75% or 50% of how hard you go in jiu-jitsu with stand-up, you would have way more injuries.
So then they get into taser discussion.
I've been tased, by the way.
Yeah? How bad is it?
No, it's like fire coursing through your body, but it's generally only for 5 seconds. It cycles for 5 seconds and then it turns off. And I taped the electrode to my foot and my shoulder. So the electricity had to go through my whole body.
So that would be worse than typical, yes?
Worse than typical, yeah.
Yeah.
If you get drive tased where they just poke you with it instead of shooting it at you, that is not a big deal. Because you can still move your arms, you can still stand. It's not like it is in the movies. So anyway, I volunteered to get tased by that one. I don't know what it felt like with my cop friends.
In use of force incidents, I'm going to round a little bit, 77%, just go with 75, knock it down a little bit. Of the untrained officers, 3 out of 4 use of force incidents, they pulled the taser. As a reference point, that sounds a little high to me, but maybe it is what it is, right? Mm-hmm. You would think maybe it'd be nice for that to be down. Nobody wants to be tased. Probably the officer doesn't want to tase. So then compare that to the test group, the BJJ officers. They pulled their tasers 54% of the time. Again, a little rounding, give it 2 out of 4. So like a 25-ish, 23 percentage point reduction in how often they're going to pull their taser out.
This makes sense to me too, because again, it goes back to being confident. If you're confident in being uncomfortable, you're going to be less likely to resort to these things. But this is a little bit difficult because tasers are part of the escalation process, right? And there's rules. I don't know what Marietta's rules about use of a taser and where that falls in use of force. So I don't really know how to comment on it without knowing exactly where tasers fall in their precinct. I'm not even sure they're called precincts anymore, but
yeah,
police department.
I had a couple other questions on this one, like could it be that these young officers who got the training go on different types of calls, like the really bad ones more experienced people go to, and it's apples to oranges? I don't know if that's a criticism because this is specifically to use of force incidences. So even if they saw less, they're only counting where it escalated to that point. But yeah, I mean, overall, this looks like a net positive and a big measurable one. Less tasers coming out seems good.
Yeah, and my overall take on this also is just that we need more data. There needs to be, and this is a good pilot, right?
Yeah.
It's more than anecdotal, right? It is actual data. And we need 100 other police departments to use it, and then we'll have some real data.
And scrutiny too, like, I know this is false, but what if it was that the BJJ officers, instead of pulling out their tasers, pulled their guns and shot the people in the head? I mean, this statistic would also go down. Yep. So we got to look, did just something else change that we haven't found yet? But looks good. Next category was in use of force cases, injuries to the officer. Well, also both injuries to the officer and to the suspects, both of which we want to go down. And the data here is a little bit harder to read. I don't think this is on purpose, but they're changing the way they report stuff case to case. It makes it a little difficult to compare. But in their 18-month tracking period, the trained officers, 29 officers were injured while carrying out arrests. Sorry, that was the untrained, the existing officers. In the case of the trained officers, almost half, only 15 officers were injured. But I don't know the denominator, so it's a weird comparison.
Were they all wearing knee pads and elbow pads?
Yeah, that's the thing, too. Like, I could see also where, the first day on the job, I'm following the employee's manual real careful. Probably after 5 years, I have an opinion about what to enforce or not. Maybe I'm laxed. Hard to say, but this looks good. Maybe.
Well, I will say this does also make sense to me, because if you know how to move your body on the ground and you know where to apply pressure, and you're, again, comfortable, you know where to put your hand, you know where to put your foot, you're less likely to be injured because it's not a scramble, it's methodical. Yeah. So it makes sense, but I would also ask the question is, are all of the officers wearing elbow pads and knee pads? Because the rah-rah, I don't need any more training type officers might be the ones not wearing the knee pads and the elbow pads, which
could lead to injury.
Yeah, you should be wearing knee pads and elbow pads as a cop.
Yeah.
However minimal.
If the data bears that out, it should be required. Otherwise, why are we paying for your recovery bill?
Yep.
Simple thing. And then maybe most inspiring of all, if true, is the injuries to suspects. So out of 20 incidents of force with the non-jiu-jitsu officers, 65% of the time, that's 13 cases, the person was hospitalized, the suspect was. This in contrast to the 13 cases for the jiu-jitsu officers, only 4 ended up in hospitalization, roughly 31%. So that's
Well, this makes
small
sense.
numbers, but cut in half.
It makes sense because you have to decide what you're going to resort to when trying to hold someone down. And if you're trained only in stand-up, you're going to do in punching and kicking and those things. You're going to do what comes natural to you, right? You're going to be more aggressive. But if you're trained to be less aggressive and to use leverage, it would make sense that these officers would be less likely to injure someone. It's just, jiu-jitsu is the whole goal of it is not to injure the person. So it's built into the system.
Seems to be working in this case.
Yeah.
From everything I can tell, this is a huge success story in Marietta. Is that Marietta, Georgia, I guess?
That might be Marietta, California. I don't know. Georgia.
Well,
yes, it says at the top, Georgia. We'll link this in the show notes, by the way, this PDF.
Is there any reason for us to believe this generalizes? Would these same techniques work in not just New York, but 70s New York?
Oh, they worked better in 70s New York.
Yeah.
They would, because people didn't know what jiu-jitsu was then. And I mean, the difference between a skilled person, someone trained, and a normal person when it comes to throwing them on the ground and controlling them, it's night and day. I mean, it is night and day. The biggest contrast, I know a guy who's 170 pounds. He's the most gifted jiu-jitsu person I've ever rolled with. I haven't rolled with Hickson, and obviously Hickson taught him a lot. But 170 pounds, he's rolled with a 330-pound NFL person and destroyed them. Right now, if punching was involved, it might be different. But in terms of body leverage and knowing how to move people around, the training here is makes a big difference. It makes a huge difference.
So that's the part I still need to be convinced about, or that's still missing for me just because this is all new to me. Everything sounds good in place now, but how do I know that these are going to be effective in the field? Like, I get what you're saying. If a person trained in this goes up against someone who's not, they'll likely win. But what if that person smashes a beer bottle and now has a weapon?
Well, then now we're talking a whole nother podcast.
Yeah. Okay. So it's different.
It's because it's use of force. It's an escalation of use of force, right? If there's a deadly weapon involved, or the person threatens you, your life with that deadly weapon, now you go up a notch. Now you can draw your gun. If somebody drew, smashed a bottle and said, "I'm gonna gut you," and they have the means to do it, you can draw your gun.
Yeah, that seems appropriate. Yep.
There's a lot of rules around it. I don't know all the rules, but there's, the police have to know those use of force escalations.
Well, I think it's important also to separate those rules from these techniques here, because we can and should debate the rules. When is escalation appropriate? Under what limited circumstances should a firearm be drawn? And ensure people are trained in following those rules. But as far as how can we make it fleetingly rarer that they even have to consider that? That should be the objective.
Yeah. It's a tough one, and that's a whole nother, like I said, a whole nother conversation, because there's always a gun involved.
The cops, yeah.
Yeah, there's always a gun involved, and that's a truth that is
unlikely
hard to get away from.
Yeah, we're not going to be Canada anytime soon.
So there's always a gun involved, which means there's always a potential for deadly force, and hopefully the person doesn't grab the gun. But once a gun is involved, everything changes.
You are closer to this than I am. How aggressively, if at all, would you roll out programs like this in other cities?
I would do it immediately and as often as possible. It doesn't have to be BJJ. It can be any other form of, it could be wrestling. It could be judo. Judo would be amazing, just as amazing as BJJ. There's a bunch of different arts. It could be any of them. It should mix in some stand-up so that they're comfortable being punched as well. So I think really it shouldn't just be BJJ. It should be a program and curriculum designed where they can rep it and then have the base of something like BJJ or wrestling or judo. But I think it would be extremely valuable. This is what I've said since the beginning. There needs to be more training. This is not an issue per se of evil intent. It's an issue of training. They banned the chokehold in New York, a particular type of chokehold that is...
Oh, that came up a lot in this that I was looking at, yeah.
It's applied in jiu-jitsu schools around the nation all the time. It's lack of knowledge that makes it scary, lack of training. Like, I could do one on anybody. I've never hurt someone. I've done probably 1,000 of these, and I've never hurt someone. I can make them pass out at will.
Right. So the jiu-jitsu community, as best I've understood it, tell me if I'm articulating this right, the perspective is that this thing in New York where they banned these holds was a big mistake because these holds are likely to lead to non-injury outcomes. So by removing that, what else are you left with but tools that are likely to lead to injury outcomes?
Exactly. That's what they've taken away. They've taken away the ability to control someone with body-to-body contact, much less, chokeholds. Choking sounds bad, but it's more like restriction. They don't choke someone to death. They just restrict airflow because once that happens, you calm them down. Or you can restrict blood flow. There's a choice. Depends on which one you use.
Yeah. Well, that's especially frustrating, the New York thing, to me, because we're at a time where I think most people would agree things about policing must change, but that doesn't necessarily mean cut back what they can do is the right answer. It could actually, the best of intentions could lead to the wrong thing here.
It will there. It will in New York. What needs to happen is they need to do more training, period. They need to do...
Who can argue with that?
Encourage... they need to encourage training. And what I loved about this study was the fact that they frame it in cost savings. That's the only way anything ever gets done. So frame it in cost savings, frame it in dollars, and they may succeed at this. But it's excellent, and it's promising.
Yeah, this should appeal to every political philosophy. It has social justice warrior improvements, and it has conservative fiscal demands for it.
Smart, really smart. And I know where you got this from. This is from Horian, right? Horian Gracie.
Yeah, I found my way to it through him.
Right. And he's a very, very talented jiu-jitsu person. He's a nephew or cousin of Hickson. I can't remember. Hickson's older. Horian's younger. Horian is like third generation from the third or fourth generation from the founder of BJJ, which was Helio Gracie. Helio had a number of sons, one of which was Royce Gracie, who competed in the first UFC, and Royce's brother was Hickson, who's the guy I trained under, and so that family spread out a lot. But Horian is very talented, and he really understands it. He articulates it very well. But this study is perfect in terms of a first study. So
this is the first thing I've looked at, on any topic of Black Lives Matter and that kind of stuff, where I was like, oh, this is an actual data problem I can look at. These statistics read well, and I'm going to keep looking into this in the sense that the truth has nothing to fear from scrutiny.
And I would like to stay on it. I'd like to, continue following up on this, because if I could help here, I would, because I know so many police.
Well, getting the word out's number one, I think. I mean, share this one-page PDF that'll be in our show notes. It tells a very concrete story, and if there's anything wrong about it, we can point to flaws and discuss them.